We've done a series of specials about what was going on in some of the neutral nations of Europe during the Great War, and today I'm going to look at Denmark. I'm Indy Nidell. Welcome to a Great War special episode about Denmark during the First World War. In 1864, Prussia and Austria had gone to war with Denmark over the duchies of Schleswig and Holstein, which resulted in a humiliating peace treaty for Denmark and the loss of a bunch of land. The resulting national trauma would define Danish politics for much of the next century, and Denmark would follow a line of strict neutrality in international affairs. That was partly, of course, from an existential standpoint. They didn't really want to anger neighboring Germany and lose even more territory, or worse, lose independence entirely. Instead, the Danes looked inward and expanded industrial and agricultural output, and increased their exports to the British and German markets. The Danish royal family was also quite active towards the end of the 19th century, marrying into several of the great houses of Europe, and Danish princes would occupy the thrones of Greece and Norway. Russian Tsar Nicholas II and Britain's King George V both had Danish mothers, and until the war broke out, they often met in the summers at Fredensborg Palace. Danish politics saw a change just before the World War broke out. In the 1913 elections, the Social Liberal Party rose to prominence, with Carl Theodor Zahle becoming prime minister, a post he would hold until 1920. His government would introduce some progressive reforms, and women would gain the vote in 1915, but the main priority during the war was to ensure Denmark's neutrality. But with the country's strategic position at the mouth of the Baltic Sea, this would be a big challenge. In fact, early in the war, Germany issued an ultimatum to Denmark to mine the Danish Straits, which would effectively block the Baltic from British marine traffic. Britain could have interpreted this as a hostile act on Denmark's part, but they didn't, and were mostly sympathetic towards the Danish position. Neutrality was largely successful, though, and Denmark traded with both Britain and Germany, much like Sweden, though constant mobilization of the army and shortages of supplies would remain issues throughout the war. Most of the trade involved agricultural products. In fact, up to 90% of Danish exports were agricultural, and were often processed products like butter or bacon, right? Now, within the territory, lost back in 1864, still lived a sizable minority of Danish-speaking people. They were now citizens of the German Empire, and many were conscripted into the German army to fight on the Western Front. At least 30,000 of them served, and morale was, as you can imagine, an issue, since there was hope that an Allied victory would bring reunification with Denmark. At least 5,000 Danes fell in the service of Germany. The Danish army itself was, as I said, mobilized. That happened August 1st, 1914, and by the 7th, the peacetime force of 13,500 men had grown to 47,000 once the reserves were called in. Now, 10,000 soldiers of this force were left to guard the continental Jutland Peninsula, while the rest manned the fortresses around Copenhagen. The army was known diplomatically as the security force, and reached its maximum size of 58,000 by the end of the year. Thing is, maintaining this force was costly, and since the enemy never came, the men were bored silly, which is still better than fighting and dying in a war, but men were gradually sent home until the force numbered around 30,000. Had the Germans invaded, Fortress Copenhagen would not have been a serious problem for them. It had been built at great expense around 30 years before the war, and consisted of several forts and batteries surrounding the city, a forward position that bisected Zealand from Roskilde to Hygge, and the ability to flood much of the northern front. The idea behind it was to hold the city long enough for foreign powers to intervene. But by 1914, it was rendered completely obsolete by the power of modern artillery, as we saw in other fortresses around the continent. In fact, one of the inner rings of the fortress was the old ramparts of the city, which was less than a kilometer from Parliament. As for trade and foreign affairs, that all continued unabated. In trade with Britain and Germany, there was increasingly the issue of inflated prices and reduced quality, but that's war for you. Overall production fell, but the trade boom created many nouveaux riches, known as goulash barons, who were hated by a pretty big chunk of the Danish population. Denmark sold some of its last colonies, St. Croix, St. Jean, and St. Thomas, which are today the U.S. Virgin Islands. They weren't really viable anymore, and if Germany had occupied Denmark, they could use the islands, so why not sell them off? They got $25 million in gold coin from the U.S. for them, which is around $550 million today. Hey, here's something. The German High Command wanted to reintroduce unrestricted submarine warfare in late 1916, but they didn't. There was the worry that neutral nations might enter the war if they did so, but they weren't worried about the U.S. See, the Romanian campaign had stretched the German army so thin that if Denmark had joined the war because of Danish shipping losses, they could have marched on Berlin in no time. It wasn't until after Romania was defeated in the field that the submarine campaign would begin. Also, when mentioning submarines, the U-boat that sank the Lusitania, U-20, was grounded on the western shore of Jutland in November 1916. The crew tried to blow it up, but only damaged it. They then abandoned it to its fate. It was again dynamited in 1925, and its tower is now on display in Torsminde. With the German defeat, there were big hopes of regaining the lost lands, though there had been no battles on Danish soil. Northern Schleswig was returned to Denmark in 1920, but there was a big controversy over land, the Easter Crisis. See, Northern and Central Schleswig were to decide which country they would be part of by plebiscite, not Southern, since it was German-dominated and would remain part of Germany. The North voted to join Denmark, but Central Schleswig voted to join Germany. This angered Danish nationalists, and King Christian ordered Zahle to include Central Schleswig in reunification. Zahle refused and resigned, and the king appointed a new cabinet. There was a huge public outcry over this, and the future of the monarchy was in jeopardy. Faced with the overthrow of the crown, Christian backed down and dismissed his government. New elections were held, and the power of the king as head of state was drastically reduced. Of course, that was after the war. Today was just a general look at what was going on in Denmark during the war, when many Danes fought and died for a nation and a cause in which they did not believe. If you want to learn more about Denmark's neighbor Sweden during World War I, you can click right here for our special about that. Do not forget to like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter for more fascinating information on the First World War. See you next time.